Started. And a very good morning to you all. Thank you so much for being here and welcome to the National Cybersecurity Center's Morning Bite of Cyber. Just a quick note on who we are. We're a nonprofit based in Colorado, focused on raising cyber awareness and education at both the state and national levels. And, it seems like, we repeat the phrase quite a bit today. We're facing an unprecedented cyber threats. But honestly, it bears repeating again, because between ransomware attacks, threats from nation states, and frankly, everything in between, we really are in uncharted territory. And in this heightened threat environment, preparing for cyber attacks is just that much more critical. But honestly, it can be hard to prepare for a cyber incident, especially when there's lots of different ideas about which steps might be first, or who you should call, or how to communicate what's going on. And that's why we're excited for our panel today, because we want to try to break it down to the basics and from the actual experts in the industry. Specifically, we'll be breaking down best practices for responding to an incident from the forensic perspective, the cyber insurance perspective, legal and communications as well. Our panelists will walk through why this topic is so important today, how to think through an incident response plan for your organizations, and ultimately those best practices to incorporate. As you have questions, please feel free to add them to the chat and we'll cover them at the end of the panel discussion. We are also recording this, and so we'll add it to our YouTube page. Just look up National Cybersecurity Center if you need to drop off or would like to share it with your colleagues. So to kick us off, we're going to let the panelists introduce themselves, and then we're going to transition into our discussion. Panelists, take it away.
Hi, I'll start. My name is Kirsten Mickelson, and I'll be speaking from the insurance perspective. I am an attorney by trade with a focus on insurance coverage as it relates to data privacy and compliance. I work at Coalition. It's a cyber insurance carrier. I started last year as a senior member of the claims team mid-pandemic. And my role at Coalition is that I handle technology and cyber incidents all day and every day. Before that, I was senior counsel at a London-based insurance company, working with affected cyber policy holders to respond to maybe hundreds of cyber incidents and third-party claims involving data breaches, cyber extortion, ransomware, DDoS attacks, business email compromises, wire fraud, and business interruption losses, just to name a few. I've also spent over a decade counseling affected cyber policy holders on all stages throughout the life cycle of a privacy matter, from the discovery of a suspected security failure through the investigation, the data breach notification process, and then conclusion of third-party claims like class action lawsuits, payment card industry assessments, and regulatory investigations. And then prior to that, I was an associate attorney in private practice at a larger firm where I focused on complex and large litigation, e-discovery, and cybersecurity with a focus on insurer clients.
Great, I guess I'll jump in next. My name is Ashley Frazier. I'm a principal incident response consultant at Mandiant. And in my role, I lead and conduct incident response, compromise assessment, and computer forensic engagements. So basically that means we conduct the technical investigations for our clients and try and answer questions for them like, how did the attacker get into the environment? Where did they go once they were in there? Did they take any information? And what were their overall goals? Prior to Mandiant, I was an FBI agent and I worked cyber cases, but both national security and also financially motivated types of cyber incidents. And then prior to that, I actually started out as an electrical engineer. So my career has definitely pivoted several times. But glad to be here today.
Hi there, my name is Chris Kleiner. I'm with the law firm Cooley LLP and part of our cyber data privacy group. So I work with all types of clients on sort of all things privacy, obviously with a particular bent towards incident response, since that's a hot topic for many of our clients. The role that our law firm serves in incident response is generally to help sort of kind of pull all the different pieces together, right? So often we are the interface both with the forensics firms like Ashley, with the insurance company like Kristen, and then as you'll hear with Jamie on a communication standpoint, but obviously give the overall guidance as to compliance with legal obligations, contractual obligations, all of the things that might be implicated in these data incidents. So glad to be here today.
And I'll be pulling up the rear here. Good morning, I'm Jamie Singer. As Chris said, I'll be providing the communications perspective. I'm an executive vice president and director of data security, privacy, and crisis communications at Resolute Strategic Services. I lead our cyber strategies division, which works with organizations across sectors, though quite a few in local governments, municipalities, K-12 school districts, specifically on the crisis communications aspects of significant cybersecurity events. Prior to Resolute, I was at Edelman, the global PR firm, for about 7 years, doing very similar work, leading their US data security and privacy group. And so our role in incident response and preparedness is to advise organizations on the strategic communications and reputation management considerations of these events. We are often engaged by outside cyber counsel and cyber insurance to be part of the incident response team for organizations. And so ultimately, our focus is on how to mitigate reputational risk and ultimately restore stakeholder trust.
Well, as you can see, we have quite the expertise here. So thank you all so much for being here and for sharing your time with us this morning and your thoughts. So to start off, we're going to have Jamie do a little bit of a kickoff of to why state and local governments really need to be thinking about incident response planning. Among all of the other things that you have to do, why do you need to make incident response a priority?
Yeah, great question, Maddie. So it's interesting because in this space, there's often an overemphasis on the large corporations that are being hit with ransomware and other cyber issues, the technology firms, major hospital systems, gas pipelines. But the reality is threat actors are targeting local governments, municipalities, K-12 school districts, and more. And they're doing this because they believe, unfortunately, that you're low-hanging fruit, and potentially with good reason. Many of these threat actors know that organizations like yourself might have a cyber insurance policy and so might consider paying a ransom. And they assume that you may be underprepared and under-resourced. In fact, there was a recent survey I was looking at of municipal bond credit analysts which showed that none of these investors think that state and local governments are prepared for cybersecurity threats. Just 6% of the respondents said that they thought local governments are on their way to being prepared for these issues. And so unfortunately, what we're seeing is the lack of incident response planning can result in significant risks for your organizations. Operationally, in terms of the disruption that ransomware attacks in particular can cause. Financially, in terms of potentially being compelled to pay a ransom, depending on if you have good backups or if there's a threat of a data leak. Legally, as Chris will talk about, depending on if personal information is compromised. And then from my perspective, reputationally, how, again, you're going to think about different stakeholders and constituents, employees, regulators, media, and maintaining that trust. So, I cannot underscore the importance of incident response planning enough. What we have found is the middle of a cybersecurity crisis is not a great time to start developing your plan and getting familiar with organizations that we're representing today. And so all the more reason to be thinking about these issues on the front end.
Oh, thank you for that. And I think to underscore that a little bit further, Ashley, if you could walk us through a little bit more of what you're seeing as what some of those common threats are that local governments in particular are experiencing.
Yeah, for sure. I know right now with everything that's going on in Ukraine, the discussion about cyber attacks or cyber type incidents is definitely elevated. And while we have seen some very destructive wiper type attacks, which essentially brick a computer within that threat space, I think at least as of now, within our area, it's still the same typical threats that we're seeing that we should prepare for. Business email compromise, nation state espionage, and most importantly, ransomware. And sometimes I think it's hard to get folks to take ransomware seriously. It can feel like this nebulous thing that happens to other people. And so I want to walk you through a scenario. I know that we have folks from lots of different organizations on here, lots of different job roles, some perhaps not technical, some more technical. But if you just bear with me for a moment and imagine yourself in this situation, I think it can be meaningful. So imagine you work for a medium-sized city and you go into work, you log into your computer and you try and open a file that you were working on yesterday, and it won't open. The file name has changed and it's got this funny looking extension on the end of it. So you go to put in a ticket with your IT department, but you can't access the ticketing system. So then you go to send an email to the IT department, but you can't access your email as well. You can't view an email, you can't send an email, none of the above. So then you try and call them from your phone, and the phone is down as well. So at this point, you pick up your cell phone and it's been on silent, but you realize you have several missed calls from your colleagues and you receive some text messages, and you find out that you're not the only person experiencing this right now, right? The city's website is down. Essentially all of the city's servers are down. So things like bill payment sites for utilities or perhaps traffic tickets are down. The city can't receive payments of any kind. Computer systems for the DMV, Health and Human Services are down. So those departments would either need to move to paper transactions or just shut down those services. So a little time passes and you hear word that the city has indeed been hit with a ransomware attack, and the threat actor is demanding Bitcoin to provide a decryptor to decrypt the files and essentially allow the city to get back up and running. And not only that, they've stolen a piece of personally health information for individuals, and they're also demanding payment to keep them from releasing that information. So this is not a great situation. Hopefully your anxiety level is raising a little bit thinking through this. The next piece of our story is the city decides that they cannot continue without paying, so they decide they will pay. They get the decryptor and begin decrypting systems, but due to limited resources, both human and storage-based resources, this is going to take weeks to potentially months to recover these systems. And also during the course of this, they've identified that some files, specifically legal documents associated with the city and digital forensic evidence that was held by the police department, was corrupted during this incident and is during the encryption event and is completely unrecoverable no matter what. So time passes and now they ask you to stand in front of the citizens and the media, and you need to be able to articulate all of the things that the city did to both prepare and prevent for this incident, as well as to potentially mitigate the severity or speed up the recovery. So in that moment right there, do you feel confident that you could articulate all of those things, or are you continuing to feel a little panic because you're not sure what those things might be? And if that's the case, then let me say this: there is no time like the present to talk about incident response preparedness, and specifically an incident response plan. And what that is going to be a checklist and a life preserver in the storm of an incident, right? I don't think anyone not having any planning or any experience in an incident is going to get everything right, is going to handle it well, sort of in the fog of a crisis like that. And so having that touch point that everyone can reference to and track back to is going to be super important in lessening the severity of an incident. And then there's two other pieces that I want to hit on about the importance of an incident response plan. And that is creating it and then practicing it, right? you want employees to internalize this so that when the crisis happens, they're going to fall back on their training and go through all of those items. Reference that document because they know that's what they need to do to get the job done. And then the second important piece of having that incident response plan and practicing it is the theoretical exercise of writing a plan down on paper does not equal the reality of actually executing that plan and learning the challenges, both human resource limitations and logistics of actually executing that. And specifically, I'm going to talk about restoring from backups, right? So if you put down on paper what that might look like, when you actually go to practice that, you are going to learn about a bunch of things that you had not thought of. And ideally, identifying those challenges early is going to allow you to mitigate them somewhat and apply those lessons learned back into your plan so that you can continue to mature as an organization in your ability to handle incidents going forward.
Thank you for that, Ashley. And you've definitely hit the nail on the head of really what this thing is and ultimately why it's so important. Chris, I want to transition to you in talking a little bit more in some slightly deeper depth of how organizations should be thinking of using that incident response plan and how it can relate at different levels of government.
Sure, thanks. So I think, as Ashley said, one of the key things that we find is having sort of an incident response plan to serve as a guidepost and really walk you through the process is perhaps the most beneficial component of this. You know, that's not to say, everybody on the panel here, I'm sure, can tell you they've experienced working with organizations that don't have a response plan. It's not to say that you can't get through this without it, right? That's why there's resources like all of ours out there to help various types of organizations through these things. But certainly it's a much more streamlined process when there are incident response documentation plans in place, especially where, as Ashley was saying, those things have been exercised and folks are familiar with them. But I think that the need is sort of, there's sort of multiple layers of why these things are important, right? First is going to be the practical one that Ashley talked about is you're going to respond much better if you have experience and a plan to execute when you're dealing with these issues. Sort of related to that also is there's a lot of different details, right? As everyone can sort of envision and listening to Ashley's circumstance, there's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of things going on. So as was discussed, the incident response plan, if nothing else, is sort of like a checklist to make sure that you're not missing anything as you go, right? You sort of think about this in the context of other things like, an airplane pilot, right? Like one of the things that they do before they take off is they go through a checklist and they actually go through a checklist, right? And that's because there's so many things you have to do. If you don't have them all documented and outlined, it's really easy to overlook something or think that something might already have been done. So an incident response plan can hit some of the tangential things. And again, not to minimize things, but like, what about contacting your insurance company, right? That might be one of the lower things on somebody's priority list when none of our systems are working and we're getting all these phone calls and what's going on, right? So there are components that are maybe just as important as others, but aren't necessarily going to be front of mind. And then, one of the key issues here is from a legal standpoint, right? These issues and incidents are often going to implicate various types of legal obligations. And so sort of at the front end, just having a plan can be seen as a requirement of having things like reasonable security measures in place to protect the data that you do maintain, right? So there's arguably even an obligation to have one in the first instance, even if you never get hit with an incident. But more importantly, I think from a legal standpoint, when you're actually responding, is it helps you make sure that you have the right things in place. One of the key issues that comes up is sort of attorney-client privilege or work product protection over an investigation and response. In the event that there is any sort of litigation or claims that might be filed in relation to an incident, it's important to have sort of followed the right procedures to make sure that you can make the best possible arguments around protecting the findings of the investigation from having to be disclosed in litigation or other circumstances. And so again, the incident response plan is a mechanism to make sure that you have the right things in place, you're doing things sort of in the right sequence, and have addressed all of those issues when, again, you're sort of trying to put out fires as you go.
And I really appreciate you bringing that aspect up, Chris, because I think in a lot of discussions around incident response planning, that legal aspect doesn't necessarily get a lot of play, maybe because we have a lot of technical folks talking to a lot of technical folks. But what you just explained is absolutely the reason why it's absolutely critical from a different perspective. So that's super helpful, and really appreciate you addressing that piece. Transitioning a little bit, Jamie, as just kind of a final point on this broader piece of why this is so critical. And thank you, Ashley. My blood pressure is really high right now. So I appreciate you walking us through that piece. But really, how do you think, from that broader perspective, again, how can state and local governments work together to really be building out these plans before we get in and now then start to really talk through the details of these?
Yeah, just to echo what my co-panelists are saying here, I mean, the importance of having something on paper, those foundational checklists are critical, and they need to be holistic. You can't just focus on the technical and operational or the legal aspects, the insurance aspects. You need to think through, again, the reputation management and communications aspects. So even simple things like who needs to review and approve a message before it goes out to your constituents. I've worked with several organizations, especially as late, who will bring 30 people to a Zoom call to group edit, a Google Doc of what they're going to say to their employees and stakeholders about a ransomware issue. And by the time you get an approved message, hours, maybe days have passed. So really important to be thinking through just those simple processes ahead of time so that you're not in a moment and working through sort of that extra red tape. It's also important, again, to be doing this type of worst case thinking as Ashley laid out now. Do the scenario planning. If there was a ransomware attack, what would you say? And start to chart out the different stakeholders, what you would say, to whom you would say, when you would say it, and importantly, how you would say it, through what vehicle. Often in these situations, your normal communications channels, email, for example, might not be available. So how are you going to communicate to constituents? Do you have emergency notification systems in place, other offline channels, and start putting those ducks in a row now? And then I would just echo what my panelists said about the testing and the training. Tabletop exercises are really effective ways to identify what those gaps are in a controlled environment. I recently worked with an organization on a ransomware tabletop with their leadership team, and we spent 30 minutes talking about what would we call this event? Would we call it ransomware? Would we call it cyber? Would we call it a network outage? And those are, again, the places that a lot of organizations get caught up with in the middle of an incident. So better to have that dialogue in this preparedness session. And again, these exercises are not just about the technical teams practicing, which they need to. These are executive level, leadership level, decision-making exercises and moments that are going to test you. And so important to be having those conversations before you are faced with the real thing.
I love that. And I think that touches on a critical aspect of this too. And I kind of referenced it a little bit with regards to Chris's comments, but a lot of our conversations around incident response planning happen in these silos of the IT department or the cyber group, that they're the ones who should be doing this, and they're the ones that are going to be responsible from beginning to end. But this is a whole of government issue, and it's a whole of state issue in a lot of ways. And just to tack on to what Jamie said about the communication piece, one of the other big things is if you can even pair up with another jurisdiction nearby you who might be interested or open to doing some of this planning together, or ultimately, even if you have like a state fusion center or a state support center that could be doing this, letting them know, hey, we really want to take this seriously. Do you have any resources to help us do this? Work with us to do it. That could be another big component of really thinking about how to bridge that gap. Because you're not going to be alone in your organization. You're not alone. You're part of a bigger ecosystem. And so this is, again, that time to start proactively communicating that and connecting with those different parties within your state. Okay, so to transition this a little bit, let's take, Ashley, you laid out such a great example. Let's just take that even as kind of our basis, and start to think a little bit about, given that type of a situation, what are some of the first steps that organizations should take?
Yeah, so the first thing I want to hit on, because I think especially a lot of smaller organizations with more limited resources have this question, and that is rebuilding immediately versus why are we even doing root cause analysis? And I think the important thing to remember is that just by rebuilding, you aren't removing the risk that an attacker could come back into your environment via the same avenue if you haven't investigated to understand how they initially got in to begin with. So that, to me, is why getting a grasp on that root cause is really important, because that risk doesn't just go away by rebuilding immediately. So that doesn't mean that those two workflows can't happen in conjunction with the other, but definitely there needs to be consideration in some respect for an investigation. To do that investigation, we need to have good evidence as investigators, right? I need to be able to reach out to all of the computers in an environment and pull back the forensic artifacts that are going to help me to tell the story of what an attacker did in an environment. And so to do that, if you rebuild immediately, then we might lose that system of interest and not be able to tell that story. The main methodology we use as investigators to pull back that data is we usually deploy a tool, an agent, as we call it, to all of the computers in an environment. And so that is going to require resources on the organization side to be able to deploy that. Typically more mature organizations have a way to do that programmatically, so it's a very quick or relatively quick process. Some of the less prepared or less resourced organizations that we've seen have to send somebody to each individual computer and deploy that agent. And that is obviously gonna extend the length of time for us to be able to start getting answers for our clients. The other thing that I wanna highlight is that you want to create an investigation-friendly environment prior to an incident. Logs can be very important in an incident. If you only have 1 week's worth of logs and the attacker got into the environment 3 weeks ago, that's going to be a significant gap in the investigation. So basically making sure we have access to the evidence initially, and then having all of the best evidence that we can going forward. And by that, I mean, for referring back to those logs, do they go back far enough? And also, do they encompass the appropriate level of detail that we'll need to be able to tell that story of what the attacker did in the environment? So those are critical things from the investigation side.
Perfect. So Chris, I think, do you want to pick up from there? All right. Beautiful.
Yeah, sure. So I think from a legal standpoint, some of the key issues, again, I sort of waved at this a bit in the initial comments, but I think considering the legal privilege issue, right? So again, out of the gate, the considerations are very frequently going to be very technical in nature. What happened? What's going on? How can we get this stuff fixed, right? But I think it's important not to overlook the legal component of that, because if you sort of move too quickly through the technical piece, you may be putting yourselves in a position that you regret later with respect to attorney-client privilege. So, the advice that I would give is to make sure that you're getting legal counsel, both within the organization and potentially outside, if you need sort of outside support and expertise involved early, right, to sort of help get through these processes. There's really no downside to getting legal involved early. If it turns out that there's nothing there, no problem, sort of no harm, no foul type of mentality, right? And so I think it's, rather than try to get too far on your own, especially from a technical standpoint, it's important to make sure that we have the right sort of decision makers in play. The other thing I'll add, sort of adding on to Ashley's advice, is it's important to remember that there's going to be multiple considerations here. And again, sort of the legal role often is kind of the quarterback or the point guard, to use some sports analogies in these response processes, making sure that all the different constituent groups are represented and being thoughtful, right? And so Ashley's point about preserving evidence certainly is going to be key from a legal standpoint. But, as everyone will know, right, there's also going to be sort of the business or practical considerations of getting our systems back up online and serving our constituencies, right? So it may be that there's a decision made that is going to not necessarily preserve all of the evidence in the interest of getting systems back up. That's not necessarily a wrong decision, but it is a decision, right? And that's the important thing, I think, about having the planning process in place, is that making sure that you have the right people making these decisions and not having the decision made for you by action or inaction, right? So again, in the particular circumstances, it can be very specific to what you're dealing with, but you may well make a conscious decision to say, look, we understand that destroying these systems and standing up something else in their place may compromise our ability to investigate on the road, but that is what we're deciding to do. That's the most important step for us to take to get our systems back up and running. I think the group here would say that's going to be very fact specific, but it's important that someone is sort of involved in making that decision versus just letting it happen.
Yeah, and Chris, I just want to echo on that last point you made there about potential decisions you might have to make in an incident, and including those in your incident response plan, because thinking through the pros and cons of decisions ahead of time when there's not the time element of pressure or pressure from elected officials or constituents, you're going to make a better decision if you've thought about it ahead of time versus in that stress-filled moment of an incident.
Yeah, I think that's right, Ashley. And again, I think this sort of goes back to the checklist mentality, right? It's not necessarily that you're going to be able to in advance think through and make a decision, absent knowing all the details of it. But it's sort of, as long as you have it flagged that, hey, before we take too many technical steps, before we take too many sort of, management or executive decisions, we're making sure that everybody's voice is being heard to make the right decision.
Mm-hmm. And to echo on that too, from the insurance standpoint, we see just so much of, hey, we have a cyber incident. What do? We have our incident response plan, our IRP. But the problem is the stakeholders on that don't know that they're involved. So you need to communicate with those stakeholders, let them know where they are in that process and sort of their role. And so that they are involved at the right time and when. I think another bigger issue too is on the government side, understand your network connectivity. We have received so many ransomware calls from municipalities where they didn't quite understand that the school district was also connected to their system, and that was the access point. So getting a good understanding of the lay of the land and your network infrastructure as well can help in a time of crisis.
And so from taking off of that point too, Kirsten, what do you see from a cyber insurance aspect of what's that critical next step? Say somebody's figured out they've contained the incident, they've captured some of the evidence, potentially now they've reached out to their legal. What do you think are those best next steps?
I just from an insurance standpoint, if there is cyber insurance and if it's a specialty cyber insurance carrier, meaning that's what they specialize in, it's not just sort of some add-on on a GL type policy. I mean, put the carrier on that IRP somewhere. I mean, hopefully not at the bottom, but get your carrier, if you have one, involved early and often. One is to preserve your coverage rights. A lot of carriers don't want you to go about retaining vendors and spending money without their consent. But it's also for those smaller organizations, smaller municipalities, where maybe you don't have an IR plan, or maybe it just hasn't been tested. Cyber insurance carriers have so many value-added services, like a 24/7 hotline where you can call in and report incidents. And this is crucial for those smaller organizations that don't have the in-house capabilities of a CISO or a chief information officer. So if you call early and you call often, better to get in there and learn of a non-issue or something minor that can be fixed, you know, than learning about something that could have been preventable too late. But also on that, a lot of cyber insurance carriers have value-added services. So on that 24/7 hotline call, there can be a cyber security professional, going back to what you were saying, is to help you walk through that process. Did you trigger your IRP? Did you contact so-and-so? Are you preserving evidence? Is legal involved? So many departments are just so siloed. They like, oh, we don't know that we have a legal counsel that can help us. And, you know, and so we can bring one in, or we can contact that person. You know, on that hotline call, if you don't know if it's a ransomware event, but you suspect some sort of weird anomaly, we can ask you to look for certain rule changes, or, you know, take a quick look at your logs. Hopefully you have more than 7 days. And on that hotline call, the cybersecurity professional, even I can do it. We can walk you through how to pull those logs, how to look for rule changes, just to see if we can identify an actual compromise. And if so, then we need to move forward with a forensic investigation, you know, just like Chris talked about, under the direction of privacy counsel, to maintain the privilege, but also to advise on any notification issues. But again, on that cybersecurity 24/7 hotline call, we can also say, hey, do you use an RDP port? Is it open? Let's shut it down. Do you have MFA? Let's change your passwords. Just quick little things like that to stop the bleeding, so that the investigation, so the evidence can be preserved and the investigation can be underway.
So that raises two really important questions. I think one is, if you do have cyber insurance and you are putting together an incident response plan, what do you recommend is the best way to engage your insurance company on your plan? Or is that something that you should do? What does that look like? And even then in the second question too, as you were talking, I almost got two different maps of like a game, you know, choose your own adventure type of a game. But if you do have cyber insurance, should you actually be the first call versus some of these other things? Or you know, how do you recommend organizations kind of think through that priority structure?
Yeah, I'll answer the second question first. So yeah, it is kind of a choose your own adventure. I would say if you don't have an IRP, which unfortunately is many organizations, lean on your cyber insurance carrier, because they can serve sort of as your project manager or quarterback and start putting vendors on their panel in place. If you do have an incident response plan, hopefully it's been tested, so you know who to contact, but simultaneously have someone also contact insurance, so that the carrier can get a lot of pre-approvals in place. Mandiant, they'll put together a statement of work. You just want your carrier to say, yeah, that's covered early on, so there are no coverage surprises later. You know, assuming you have an incident response plan, you are, to answer your first question, you are working with your insurance carrier to make sure any outside vendors are pre-approved or on the carrier's panel, so that there are no sticking points or battles of vendors kind of in the heat of the moment. I think as a pre-incident service, certainly do lean on your cyber carrier to assist in drafting an IRP. There is no, I saw a question in the chat. I don't think there's one cookie cutter, one size fits all type plan, but there can be high level kind of points of what should be in the plan. And, you know, if the circumstances are right, it depends on your carrier. It probably depends on the premium. I know Coalition does it. They will do a tabletop exercise with one of their privacy counsel firms to test it. And testing your plan is just so crucial, because I think Ashley hit it on the head. You do not want to speed date with your vendors in time of crisis.
Hey, Kirsten, one insurance related question that we've seen come up from time to time is, you know, some hesitance to reach out to the carrier because look, I don't want to file a claim and then my premiums are going to go up. But, you know, we've found that often the carriers will have something that is short of an actual claim unless one's actually necessary, right? Is that understanding generally right? I know it's going to be very specific to the policy or carrier, but can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I can. I think there's this, it's not a misconception, but insurance has generally been kind of understood as I crashed my car, I'm going to go fix it, and then I'll submit the bill to the carrier. More of like a reimbursement concept. But with cyber insurance, it's more active, for lack of a better word. It's active in that it provides all these sort of upfront services. A lot of scanning goes on. I think a lot of like coalition will monitor your systems and say like, hey, we see that you use MS Exchange. There was a 0-day vulnerability, you need to patch. So like those kind of proactive alerts to help you avoid the incident in the first place. And so with that also is, if you are experiencing an incident, I would recommend to call your carrier, because I think the best risks, and I'm not an underwriter, are the ones that have had an incident, because they've tested their plan, they know the access point, and they've fixed whatever it is that needs to be fixed going forward, or they've remediated it. And then kind of on a second point, do notify your insurance carrier, because I think what I've seen is a lot of entities try to self-help and then foot the bill, send the bill to insurance, but the investigation wasn't done properly. Or like Chris mentioned, the technical piece was done, but it was not under the direction of counsel. Some opportunistic plaintiff's lawyer gets a hold of whatever negligence and then makes a claim. And so with insurance involvement, they can put you on a very happy path to try to mitigate and minimize your exposure.
That was beautiful. I think that this is an area that a lot of jurisdictions are struggling with better understanding. So I think that explanation of just how to think about cyber insurance was perfect. It put a lot of pieces in place for me too. So thank you. That was beautiful. Jamie, as kind of the last piece of this best practices step. So we've done some of these steps of engaging the right folks and doing the right things. Talk about that communication piece.
Yeah. So, the ultimate goal of the communications response in these issues is to mitigate risk, whether it's litigation risk, reputational risk, or even risk related to making sure costs associated with your incident are covered by insurance. And so what's interesting is, typical crisis management 101 is you should communicate as quickly as possible, as transparently as possible. The problem in cyber is that can actually open your organization up to more risk, because communicating too quickly when a forensic investigation that Ashley's team is doing is still ongoing might create a situation where you're communicating so-called facts that might change or be fluid. And that's only going to erode trust. People still talk about the Target case as an example of this, where the CEO went on camera and talked about it impacted this many cardholders. And then the next day said, well, actually the number is this. And the next day, no, the number is this, and so on. And so you have to be very careful about putting information out there too quickly that could change. At the same time, there's going to be pressure from your stakeholders, from media, local media, especially for your organizations, who will want information and want answers. And there's a way to engage media strategically. There is a degree of breach fatigue out there. There are rarely incidents where the news cycle extends beyond 7 to 10 days, unless the scope of the issue is enormous, or if the communications response is bungled. So the goal is to play into that fatigue a little bit. And this means taking a transactional approach to media relations, providing high-level written statements, not going into details that are still fluid, leaning on the ongoing investigation. We have found this to be more effective than live interview situations where you're going to be asked those really difficult questions that you either can't answer or don't want to answer. How much was the ransom? Are you going to pay? Why or why not? So taking control of that media narrative is really important, because ultimately you want media to go away. And then, finally, I would say a misstep that we are frequently seeing is organizations are very focused on those external stakeholders, your constituents, the media, and they forget their employees, their own employees, and how you're going to communicate with them and what you should say to them. And this is a missed opportunity, because they're your biggest advocates. They are the mouthpiece of your organization to your constituents. So everyone in your organization, from leadership to your frontline folks, need to have a tight script of what they can say, what they shouldn't say, and most importantly, how to escalate those questions so they don't feel overburdened with having to make up a script on the fly. At the same time, your employees are also your biggest communications risk. Often we are seeing those are the folks that are leaking information to media. They're the source of anonymous quotes. And they do that when they don't feel the organization is communicating with them. So all the more reason to be thinking again about that inside out communication strategy so that you're controlling the narrative to the best of your ability.
Love that. And that is another key thing is the internal piece. And I think hitting on that is really critical and appreciate that. All right. So before we jump into questions, we're just going to do a quick round robin of final takeaways. We've got some slides for everybody to share. I do want to mention real quick too that in this, we will be sharing this out to all of the participants in this. So if you want to share this out with your management team, know that we'll be sharing this out once we've got the rendering complete. But we did just want to do a couple of quick final takeaways. I'm a visual person, so just wanted to do a quick summary, and there we go. We'll start.
Great, thank you. So my first takeaway is take proactive steps to harden your environment. In this situation, an ounce of prevention is most definitely worth a pound of cure. There was a ransomware incident that I worked this year where the company was a manufacturing company. They had a completely flat network. So the IT network or user land was on the same network as their OT environment or their manufacturing side. So when they were hit with ransomware, they were essentially dead in the water and losing millions of dollars a day. So one of those proactive hardening steps that we would definitely recommend is network segmentation. And doing that in advance can potentially significantly limit the impact to your organization in an actual incident. And then second, hopefully we've all made the case at this point for how we can benefit your organization in an incident, and it can reduce cost as well as reduce time to recovery and mitigation if you engage with those parties ahead of time. And then, sort of taking those first two and feeding them into this last one is have that incident response plan and practice it. So everybody in your organization is on the same page. Everybody is on the bus and heading in the same direction. Those discrete tasks that different folks on the team need to perform, restoring from backups, password reset, communicating with the media, those have all been practiced too. The challenges are understood and at least somewhat mitigated. And doing that ahead of time is going to make for a more smooth incident response handling. I'm not going to say it's going to be smooth sailing. An incident is always going to be stressful, but anything that you can do to reduce that stress and make it a little bit easier is going to go a long way for the organization.
Thanks, Ashley. All right, next one. Here we go.
Yeah, this is mine. So, I mean, I hit it earlier, but call your cyber carrier early and often. Like I mentioned, it just breaks my heart to get notified after an incident after, excuse me, the policyholder does try to self-help, only to realize that the response was not done correctly, and it does need to be fixed. Cyber insurance policies, they operate more like a partner in the incident response process and do include just so many value-added services. So it is unfortunate not to be aware of them. And then there was a comment in the chats too about other incidents, not just ransomware. Ransomware, it's loud and it's kind of in your face. But this goes for other sort of anomalies, business email compromises or suspected BECs. Wire fraud is just rampant, especially we've had a couple government agencies wire funds seemingly to a vendor, but to a threat actor. Or any concerns about PHI or PII, threat actors want to monetize however they can. So do call your cyber carrier often. The next one, similar to that, lean on your carrier as a part of the incident response process for recommendations and remediation going forward. Obviously, the carrier will probably defer to the breach coach and the forensic firm for specifics, but the carrier can provide very high-level generic recommendations since they handle dozens of cyber incidents all day, every day. And then finally, totally unrelated and super granular, but please have regularly tested viable backups that are stored outside your environment. there are so many times we get ransomware calls, we ask about the status of backups, and the victim gets so excited when they say that they're able to recover, only to learn that those backups were saved on the same network that's infected. So if you do store backups in the same place, it's not really a backup.
That's a very good point.
It happens. I'm just lesson learned, I'm telling you.
No, thank you.
Just to wrap up on my end, again, ensure that the strategic communications planning is incorporated into your overall incident response plan and preparedness. Again, we've talked about today sort of looking at these issues holistically. So again, from a communications perspective, who would be on your crisis communications response team? What are the different roles and responsibilities? Who needs to be involved in approving a message before it goes out? And starting to think through those scenario plans and get some templates in place. What would you say to media on day one of a ransomware attack versus day 5, and start that planning early. And then looking at this not just as a PR or media exercise, but thinking holistically about your stakeholders, identifying and prioritizing those in advance, internally and externally, and understand how you'll be able to reach those folks, especially if traditional communications channels are down, and who owns the communications with each of those stakeholder groups. And then finally, every organization that I work with on the very first call tells me they're a transparent organization. And that's great. But again, as we've talked about today, there is risk in being too transparent. So understanding how to balance that, keeping in mind your values as an organization, but understanding that every word you say has implications, and exercising that message discipline throughout an incident.
Those are perfect takeaways. And again, we'll be sending all of this out with the final recording of the link. To jump into some of the quick questions, there was an early question that was asking if there are sample template documents of incident response strategies, and they're also considering running a security assessment, and have some questions about if you have recommendations around that.
I think that there are some maybe more basic incident response plans floating around on the internet. If you just Google incident response plan, I think certainly it will require some effort as well to be able to tailor that specifically to your organization. And then in terms of the second piece, there are lots of different organizations that offer different kinds of security assessments. And so I think it's important to understand what is your threat and risk profile, what is of highest concern. In security, you certainly can't boil the ocean. So you need to understand the areas of your environment that are of highest risk. Usually externally facing assets and services and accounts is probably number one. But then also doing that internal hardening, network segmentation can also go a long way. Unfortunately, you can probably spend an infinite amount of money on security. So you really need to be smart about how you're using your resources and identifying your threat profile and also your highest risks, where are the crown jewels in your environment, can go a long way to making that determination about where the best way to spend your money is.
And also employee training too. You can spend all the money in the world on security, but sometimes your weakest links are the ones behind the computers as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I would also add on the template aspect, one of the resources that we'll be happy to share out, we're finalizing for Colorado, we're trying to do some better work of standardizing some of the incident response templates that organizations are working off of, just so we can start to speak the same language when we're helping each other out. And that's going to look like it's a 12-step piece that we'll be happy to share out once we've got that finalized here in a little bit. And the last piece too is, if you do on just that question of other recommendations, if you do have additional questions, yay, the cat finally made it through. If you do have questions about some of those recommendations and want to go in more in depth, feel free to contact us, because we've got all of these different, obviously amazing experts at hand. And so definitely happy to dig into that a little bit deeper. then there was another question too regarding the whether we consider a scam or a bluff, for example, a browser malware scam, an incident, even if no computer or phone was actually hacked.
Yeah, so there are different levels of incidents in an organization, and really anything that could potentially impact the integrity, confidentiality, and availability of an environment could be considered an incident. But if there's not a true compromise, then probably less likely that they're going to engage someone like Mandiant to come in and do a full-scale incident investigation. Typically, in-house resources can triage that and determine that it doesn't need to escalate. One of the things that can sometimes be included in incident response plans, specifically tailored to cyber incidents, are playbooks. So specific types of things, let's say a user clicks on a phishing email, how are we as the security organization within a company, what is our checklist to respond to this event? And do we need to escalate it to higher levels of analysis or ultimately engage a third party?
Just to tie that together with Kirsten's advice too, right? I think you don't know what you don't know, right? Like when something first comes in, it's hard to say that it's a scam or it may not be legit or there might not be other implications to it. And so our experience has been that, reaching out to your carrier and investigating is a good step. Oftentimes they can get, people like Ashley on the phone that can sort of work through this fairly quickly. It's often not a question necessarily of expertise or intelligence as much as it is Ashley's probably seen this 6 times since last week, right? And so I've been on calls with forensics firms where they'll, within a few minutes, sort of walk the technical team through, hey, open this folder, look here, look up there it is, right? Like because they've seen this, right? Like these are different skills than folks exercise on a daily basis. So it is helpful to leverage those resources.
Perfect. And yes, somebody did mention the resources from DHS and CISA on this. I think to several of the points made on the call, there's a template out there for everybody. I think part of the biggest thing is it's just when you're going through that exercise, trying to make sure that it does reflect what your organization's needs are, and trying to tailor it as much as possible, because you don't want to get stuck on a step that you go, wait a second, we don't have that resource. What do we do now? So just trying to find that tailored approach. And I think that that's actually it in terms of questions, and we are actually right at our time. So I do want to say a huge thank you again to the panelists who attended. This was really, really phenomenal discussion, really got into some details that I think, again, are just not always brought up in these kinds of conversations, and they're the critical real world aspects. So thank you all so very, very much. And the last piece that I do just want to say, and it really does hit on that tone of some of the takeaways that I think all of you hit on, you are not alone in this. So even though we can have that tendency to feel like, oh gosh, I got attacked, that's shameful somehow, or feel embarrassed about it, please don't. As the data talked through today, like everybody's getting hit with things. And the best thing that we can do is really continue to try to turn cybersecurity into a team sport, whether that's within your own organization, whether that's across your organizations, with your state, whatever that looks like. But please do engage resources like us, like the fabulous individuals on today's call, and make sure that you know that you're not alone, and that you have that opportunity to really reach out. So again, thank you everybody so much. We'll get this rendered and out to everyone here shortly, and really appreciate everybody's time. Have a great rest of your Thursday.